start off with, I had two main concerns when I realised I was actually first on today. One was, even though I've spoken to them loads before, thanks, Noel, even though I've read countless of their articles and know of them as a business, was making sure I actually said BVNK correctly. The other was then seeing the name of the inaugural event, whether it's Currency London, Currency LDN, or whether just to call it Currency. So I'm glad I've kind of got both of those out the way a little bit. I guess also from my side is that we also have a company social tonight. We're actually going to karaoke. So yeah, just so you know that I will not be doing any Sweet Caroline tonight or today for this actual talk. So I guess from my perspective, I think I just want to say a massive thank you to BVNK and the team for putting this together. It's an amazing venue. It's great to be here from an FXC intelligence point of view. And yeah, just a big thanks to our hosts for actually kind of bringing us all together to start off with. So I guess from our side is that we do spend a lot of our time looking at the B2B payment space, looking at the B2B cross-border space. In fact, as far as we know, we are the only cross-border data specialists that are actually out there. So it's very much part of our daily conversations, part of the research that we do. And I think today, what I want to go through is some of the recent history, the size of the markets that we're seeing at the moment, what that potential growth might be, and within that growth, then what the trends are, and all those expected trends that we expect to see now, but also as we continue to grow over the next 7 to 8 years. So who are we? I'm not expecting everyone to know exactly who we are. Our purpose is to underpin the cross-border payments space with our data, with our insights. We release, as kindly mentioned by Matt, a newsletter on a weekly basis. We are releasing data on an intraday perspective to remittance players, to B2B players, to regulatory bodies, all the way through. And from our side is that we want to make sure that we are engaging with as many stakeholders across the industry as we possibly can to gain those insights and to actually then collect that from our perspective as well. So I guess, how do we do that? We track data in 110 countries plus, over 25,000 corridors, and that's across the remittance, the SMB, and the B2B space. That feeds into a lot of decisions that are made on a daily or an intraday basis for organizations, as well as strategic decisions such as, should I go into this next market? What is that opportunity, and what does that look like? I think from our side, and for where I want to start is with the pandemic. I think it's probably safe to say that the pandemic changed things sometimes for the better, sometimes not so much for the better. I was actually in the office yesterday and was waiting for the lift. And as lift etiquette dictates, the first person that gets there needs to summon the lift, and that's how it works. And the poor guy in front of me was still trying to use his elbow to summon the lift to him. I like to think of myself as fairly patient, but 35 seconds, 40 seconds later of that not working in any way whatsoever, I did actually have to kind of reach across and take the reins there. But I think, from my point of view, is that particularly on the cross-border payment space, what we really saw was a huge change, not just in B2B, but also in consumer. From consumer perspective, we saw a real downturn. We saw, I guess, really a lot of changes from a consumer, particularly from a retail space, where people then move to more of those that are online. But from a B2B point of view, it actually flourished. Businesses all of a sudden were able to take a bit of a breath. Finance teams were able to actually take a step back. They stopped kind of processing receipts from expenses and doing some of the mundane things that take place. And actually, they were able to then start to take a look at the actual pain points that they were going through. We saw e-commerce explode from a B2B point of view, cross-border. Those that had been traditionally offline moved online and are there to stay, and that's how that's worked. We've seen then those e-commerce platforms like Amazon, Alibaba, go through huge hiring sprees as they look to cope with the demand that took place. And due to the pandemic, because of supply chains then being disrupted, we saw organizations starting to accelerate in regard to the conversations that they were having. where does blockchain fit in? Where does DLT fit in? How is that going to work for us in the future? And more than that, in the very near future, it became a very focus point in regards to what people were starting to look like and what we saw within the market. We also then saw a real change around SMEs. Those that had been traditionally offline, they've been working as they were expecting to do so. They actually started to increase their footprint within cross-border. We expect that to absolutely continue, and relatively so, that SME, SMB cross-border footprint will actually be as big as large corporates in the future. Within the pandemic as well, we saw just an increased focus on B2B. We saw Western Union actually choose to sell Convera, or what is now known as Convera, for just short of $1 billion. Flywire went public during that time and continued to then add more features from their perspective in regard to not just cross-border, but also domestic payments, tuition, how that ties into late fees, making sure that they were then aligning to some of their current pain points that they saw today. And we then saw FleetCor rebrand to Corpay and also acquired more global reach and extend more into Europe and into the UK as well during that time. It's potentially not a good time to mention, and that says Tiger Global, by the way. It's potentially not a good time to mention them. As anyone that's seen the news this week is the fact they've actually mentioned that they're going to start to retreat from startups this week. But throughout the pandemic, their focus on B2B cross-border payments really increased. They started off fairly slow, looking really at traditional public companies. But now, from their perspective, 13% of their portfolio is actually within the B2B cross-border payment space. And then players like Stripe, who had already invested within the payment space, they're obviously exceptionally active within the payment space, started to look at geographies where they actually traditionally had less presence, particularly Pakistan, particularly in the Philippines with PayMongo and with SafePay as well. So it wasn't just a focus from the B2B payment companies themselves, but also those that are actually investing at the same time throughout that pandemic period. I think 2022 was a mixed year. I think we could probably all say in general. It started with Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars. You could probably say figuratively that Liz Truss did pretty much the same with the British economy. And from a B2B payment space perspective, we saw further consolidation off the back of it. Again, as mentioned, we've seen some huge changes across 2022. So rather than actually stalling the progress that was made throughout the pandemic, we actually just saw consolidation within the market. Evo is a great example of this, with being purchased by Global Payments. Global Payments actually added another 4.5 million merchants and then another 1,500 financial institutions to their portfolio. Flywire saw growth of 40% in that time. IBAN actually acquired Cornhill, which again added their UK reach. So those that were looking to buy, not just in regard to their reach, but also what they could do from a product portfolio perspective as well. And although we've consistently seen this disruption over the last three years, and we'll continue to see that in the market, it's safe to say that among the non-bank players, no one actually has more than 1% globally, which is a huge, huge piece and a huge opportunity within the market still. We've barely kind of got started. We've seen huge changes in the market when it comes to the remittance part, but from a B2B perspective is that there's a lot of more growth to come, and it's lagging behind ever so slightly where remittances have been. I think even though, and we have done quite a lot of work on this, is that we expect to then see growth from a market share perspective to continue with players, whether that's through consolidation, whether that's through specializing in particular verticals, is that we don't really expect to see some main players that will have a substantive share in the next few years overall. However, in certain disciplines, we would expect to see that. And that's exactly what we expect to see in the future. It was fortuitous timing when we were asked whether we'd want to come along to this event and speak. We have, 2 weeks ago, actively released up for the first time our B2B market sizing data. It wasn't planned, I promise. It was just happened to work like that. And we've taken that first step into the B2B market space from a cross-border point of view, broken down that data into corridor level, and started to take a view as to then where we expect to see the market size within 2030 as well. So at the moment, the cross-border space is actually the size of 190 million, 90 trillion. We expect by 2030 that to grow by another 100 trillion to 290. It's a huge, huge change that we're expecting to see over the next 7 years from a B2B cross-border payments perspective. As you can see, really, that the wholesale piece is a huge part of that. It's 146 trillion at the moment. But from what the retail B2B payment space is across, which also includes the remittance space as well, is already at a size of 39.3 trillion. And we expect that, again, to grow within the B2B cross-border space to over 65 trillion within the next 7 years. I think, as you can see, that how we've broken this out is by large enterprise goods, large enterprise services, and then via SMB, as well as looking at consumer to business, consumer to consumer, and then business to consumer as well. Business to consumer, as an example, being paying for contractors, consumer to business paying for softwares across, which is mostly card payments at the moment, certainly, although we expect, again, further disruption to take place. And then the split between large enterprises can be done in two ways, really. One around the size of employees, so 250 plus would be into large enterprise, 250 below into SMB, or then into actually the payment size that we're looking at as well. So less than $10,000 as an example, or above into SMB. And that is how we've started to look at splitting what those small to medium-sized business payments might look like versus large enterprise payments as well. By 2030, we expect B2B e-commerce to grow 120% and to be responsible for the biggest growth across the board when it comes to B2B cross-border payments. Part of that is based on what we saw within the pandemic. I think it reflects a proliferation of marketplaces that are now offering services and goods as well. And I think particularly it's, although slower to gain momentum from a perspective of a B2B point of view, it's really catching up now. And this is where we're going to see the biggest movement as well as the biggest value over the next 7 years. In comparison, from a consumer perspective, we'll see it grow to 44.1 trillion. And part of that is due to the fact that a lot of the consumer evolution has already taken place. We already have a lot of digital capabilities. We have a lot of sophisticated markets where people are used to shopping around. From a B2B point of view, loyalty has always been part of it. However, we expect to see similar approaches to this, where actually loyalty will be based on sophisticated models. How can we actually make sure that the UX is going to work for those clients? How can we offer them competitive rates as they become more and more educated in the space as they start to move and digitize? So I think accompanied with the market size trends is just to then talk around how that links to the actual market size itself. We will absolutely see the B2B cross-border space expand significantly over the next 7 years. SMEs, SMBs are becoming a major customer, and they'll only become more sophisticated in their needs. And that obviously ties into new technologies, DLT, blockchain, and how that works. And technology is really going to transform how businesses handle payments in general. It's going to be accompanied by increased digitization. It's going to be accompanied by DLT and blockchain. And I think particularly, although we've had, I guess, what has been widely described as kind of crypto winter as of 2022, is actually a lot of the major players are still looking at this very heavily. We already see MoneyGram that have already partnered with, from a from a Stellar point of view, they're already using this on a regular basis. And we really expect to see that instant settlement become more and more of a pressing question when it comes to B2B and cash flow, whether that is in large corporate or whether that's in the SMB market also. I think it's also worth saying, particularly based on everything that's happened within 2022, that macroeconomics is going to take a bit of a role. Supply chains are going to continue to be disrupted. We have certain parts of the world that are already looking to rely less on the US dollar, particularly in Asia. And what used to be known as, I guess, as on the slide, formerly exotic currency pairs, is that they're being used more and more now, because the ability to actually access markets that SMBs didn't have access to before is now suddenly available with the networks and the building blocks that are being put together from a Rails perspective. And I think within that is then just the opportunities for the industry. And I think from our side is that where we really see, again, the size of the market that's out there, the fact that no one really has a huge market share as of yet, we absolutely expect to see businesses becoming specialized in the verticals that they deal with. We expect to see digital platforms become far more accessible. And that obviously copies in regard to the rise that we see in the B2B e-commerce piece over the next 7 years and that market share. Small businesses will increasingly have a cross-border footprint similar to large businesses. It's not just for large enterprise anymore. And it's going to be even more pronounced depending on the goods that are operating, particularly non-physical physical goods and services that can be delivered online, that we're going to see that huge change in regard to how businesses are actually transacting across borders. And really, as with anything, it will be sophisticated, those seamless experiences that are going to end up out on top, like we've seen in remittances. It's not just going to be that focus on the bottom line. 3 to 7 days, transfer days are going to be long behind us, and it is going to be instant settlement that will be a focus of the future for businesses of all sizes. That is pretty much all for me. So thank you for listening and for indulging me.